Great. Well, I'll start. I can see people are arriving, and that's great. And welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to start by way of using my sort of prerogative as a convener to start with an ethnographic vignette. As a callow youth, I was a carer looking after young people with physical disabilities. This is before I became a teacher and before latterly I became a lecturer. And in my duties, I had to feed a young man called Anthony his meals, both breakfast, lunch and dinner. Yeah, Anthony was a quadriplegic, non-verbal communicator, but actually a brilliant communicator using alternative and augmentative communication devices. And sort of one day, the occupational therapy decided that actually Anthony's independence would be enhanced by using a feeder, which was this device that where I would have to cut up his food, put it on the tray, and then leave him to get on with his meal. Now, some years later, as a deputy head of a school for children with special educational needs, I invited Anthony back as an adult to talk to my staff about inclusion, which is what Lauren and George are going to start talking to us about. And one of the things he talked about was this day where he wasn't going to have a meal with me. He was going to use this independent eating trough. And he specified that actually what he felt he was being deprived of at that moment was actually his social and thought independence. So it's kind of just this sort of thing about this sort of unintended consequences. There was a well-meaning intervention that enabled Anthony to eat independently, but actually what it deprived him of was the ability to have a conversation with somebody as he was kind of having a meal. And that sort of, I was reminded of Anthony reading Lauren and George's fantastic paper, and their thematic analysis of inclusive pedagogy reminds me that inclusion is a philosophically contested matter that has many different meanings to many different people. And what they do in the paper, which I hope they'll outline shortly, is to urge a consideration of the context that we work in and examine how we theorize things like inclusive pedagogy. So I'm going to now introduce George and Lauren. They're both at the Exeter Graduate School, and they join us from a sunny southwest down there. Lauren's work, she is interested in social inclusion and participation and matters of inclusive pedagogy and provision. And George, similarly, his research interests explore aspects of inequalities in compulsory and higher education. And he has particular, actually, I think it's the other way around. I think it has a particular interest in, Mrs. Lauren has a particular interest in gender, social class, disability, and the intersection with those sort of identity facets. But they're both interested in inclusive pedagogies, and that's what we've asked them to come and talk to us about. And it fits in really well with some of the work that we're trying to do as a department going forward. So Lauren and George, I'm going to hand over to you. They've got a PowerPoint, and George has got some other amazing technology that he's going to invite us to use as well. So over to the pair of you.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks. Yes. So yeah, thank you very much for inviting us to be here to speak to you today. So as Jason was saying, I'm Lauren, this is George, and we're from the Graduate School of Education in Exeter. And so in today's seminar, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be discussing some of our recent work, which explores quite critically the concept of inclusion in higher education. So we'll be focusing in particular on a systematic scoping review that we conducted recently that sought to understand how inclusive pedagogies are understood and conceptualized by academics who are researching and writing about higher education. But we'll also be discussing in the process some of these deeper philosophical and moral tensions around inclusion that we argue are sometimes neglected or missing from debates that are taking place in higher education in that context. So, George, have you got the slides?
Would you like
yes. If you put up the slides, yes, or do you want to do the Mentimeter first?
I think so,
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So we're going to try this. Fingers crossed it will work. So we've got a bit of audience participation at the start here. So we wanted to ask you, what 3 words would you use to describe inclusion in higher education? Okay, so we've got the code for you to use here. And so if you go to menti.com, if you've got your phone or a tablet or on your computer and just type in that code 8775 7528. Yeah, so what 3 words would you use to describe inclusion in HE? And then hopefully they will populate here in a word cloud, and we'll just discuss a few, kind of provide some context before we go into the discussion. Great, it's working, George. Good.
A very interesting word. Right.
Interesting.
Some of them are very, I mean, all of them are really interesting. Some of them are quite critical as well, like contested.
Okay, are there any there you want to pick out on, George? What do you think?
I'm not sure whether contested means that it has been mentioned, because it appears to be larger, whether it has been mentioned more than one time. That would be quite interesting.
I think so. I think it's proportional. Yeah.
I think it does give us some sort of context, and it's in some sort of way, it's not very different from what we will describe in our own presentation.
Yes.
So would you like me to go to the slides then?
Yes, I think, yeah, so what I'm quite interested in here is in particular, so we've got this notion of access. So maybe inclusion at the point of access to higher education, or is it maybe in terms of pedagogy when we're in higher education? I like the sensitive one and the subjective, illustrating maybe some of the complexity around it. And decolonization, I think, is quite interesting as well. We'll be picking up on some of these themes. And this was what was coming through in our systematic review. Vital, I like that one. Justice and equity. Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, that's excellent. Okay, yes, please, George. Right. Okay, yes, so if we go on to, so what I'll begin is by giving you a brief overview of the structure of today's presentation. So what we're going to be doing first, so I'm going to start off and I'm going to be talking a little bit about the context of higher education in the UK, in particular about its organisation and structure. And then I'm going to move on to introduce our systematic scoping review, which we conducted recently on inclusive pedagogies in higher education, give you a bit of background on that and some of the methods that we used. Then I'm going to hand over to George, who's going to discuss some of the theoretical work on inclusion and some of the important debates going on around that. Then he's going to hand over to me again, and I'll link it back to the findings of our review, how we applied some of this theory in our review. And finally, we're going to discuss some of the implications from this review in terms of teaching practice in higher education. Okay, next slide, please, George. Okay. So first of all, what I want to do is introduce some of the background to the higher education sector in the UK in which some of our discussions about inclusion might be grounded. So as you're all probably aware, having likely worked in higher education institutions perhaps for a number of years, is that a number of changes have taken place in recent decades in terms of the organisation and structure of universities. So since around maybe the 1980s, neoliberal reform has seen the further embedding of free market principles, competition and choice into the sphere of higher education in the UK, which is a situation mirrored in countries across the globe. So this has been understood in particular by the UK government as a means to enhance productivity and quality within the sector. This has also resulted in what's been referred to as the massification of higher education. So whereas universities were once elitist institutions, accessible only to a privileged few, policy reform has taken place. It's grounded in conceptualizations of universities as instruments of the knowledge economy and as driving wealth creation and as driving economic and social development. And this has meant that more and more students from increasingly diverse backgrounds are entering higher education. Not only this, but internationalization of the sector has opened up opportunities for geographic mobility, with students traveling across the world to study for a degree. Okay, so how has all of this impacted on teaching practice? Well, teaching within universities has traditionally and arguably taken quite a specific form, grounded in a hierarchical instructional model where the lecturer is the authority and transmits information to students in quite a one-directional manner. However, there's been this growing recognition that this approach might not best serve the interests of students from diverse backgrounds who might have different learning requirements. So, for example, international students might have additional language needs, or maybe a small number of students might require modified learning resources. So in fact, more recently, there has been a push towards a different instructional model being used, one that is more active, more dialogical, more collaborative, as grounded in social constructivist theories of learning and critical and emancipatory scholarship. So maybe thinking critical theory and feminist pedagogy. It has often been assumed that this model aligns more closely with some of the philosophical tenets underpinning inclusion and inclusive pedagogies, as it places more emphasis on students' learning needs. And indeed, this discourse of inclusive teaching and learning appears to be increasingly championed by higher education managers, as is this more general focus on fostering an inclusive environment within the university. So university websites will often contain sections outlining their policies in relation to inclusion. In fact, we've been online and we've seen that Oxford has its own equality, diversity, inclusion policy for the whole university and separate ones for the different colleges. So this championing of inclusive pedagogies as an instructional approach might be seen as grounded in wider concerns about facilitating social justice and bringing about equity in an educational sphere that's traditionally been seen as quite hierarchical and elitist and the domain of white upper middle class men. Yet a turn to inclusive pedagogies might also be seen as strongly linked with a performativity culture that's said to have become increasingly embedded in higher education. So university leaders are now under increased pressure to improve the quality of educational provision so that students as consumers might feel that they are receiving value for money in this increasingly competitive higher education marketplace. So we would argue that we need to be very aware of the possible underlying reasons behind this emerging inclusive agenda. Okay, next slide, please. So now what I want to do is turn to the research that we conducted. So we've become increasingly interested in how this discourse of inclusion appears to have been taken up within the higher education sector and within our own institution. And we wanted to probe this a little bit more deeply. So we saw some tensions apparent in the ways that we were being encouraged to be inclusive in our teaching. But we wondered, what is inclusive teaching? What might it look like? What is the literature saying about this? So in 2019, we conducted a systematic scoping review to explore how inclusive pedagogies have been conceptualized and researched within the higher education literature. So we searched 5 electronic databases and we used a selection of key terms relating to inclusive pedagogy and inclusive teaching. So in other words, the how of teaching. So we screened a few hundred abstracts and we narrowed this down using our inclusion criteria to 31 papers that we felt matched our inclusion criteria. And then we analysed these 31 papers thematically, and in particular, we tried to discern how the different authors of the papers had understood and conceptualised inclusion in their work. And we felt we needed to draw on here a theoretical framework in order to do this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass over to George, who will introduce some theory, some of the theoretical and philosophical work around inclusion from the compulsory schooling sector and in the field of special educational needs, where rich debates have taken place about inclusion for many decades. So we wanted to translate some of these theoretical ideas into the realm of higher education to understand what inclusion might look like in this specific educational phase.
Thank you, Lauren. If we are to reflect on inclusion and what it might mean, one would have to acknowledge that it is an ambiguous concept. Felder, for example, writes that although there seems to be consensus on the meaning of inclusion on a superficial level, there is a lot of ambiguity if one examines the values associated with inclusion. In other words, we might intuitively feel that inclusion is a good thing by describing what it might involve and how it would be translated into practice is more complex, as inclusion has been linked to values often difficult to define. In a Western context, inclusion has been associated with values such as fairness, respect, and democracy. However, such values are understood and implemented differently by different people, thus leading to ambiguities and tensions. And one could see, for example, the work of Brown and Norwich. So although people might agree that inclusion is about respect and acceptance, they often have very different views in terms of what this means in practice. Inclusion is increasingly being used to explore the experiences of children and young people across the range of human diversity, and as in this quote from Mel Ensko, which is one of the prominent figures of the inclusion literature. Ensko seems to assume that exclusion is the result of environmental or attitudinal factors triggered by diversity, and concludes that inclusive education starts with the belief that education is a basic human right and the foundation for a more just society. However, if we turn our attention to the academic literature, inclusion in education is a fragmented notion that is subject to different interpretations. Inclusion, for example, is discussed as being about all children learning together, whereas others describe inclusion as academic and social participation irrespective of where education takes place. Inclusion is perceived as an ethical obligation, but it has also been discussed as individual choice. Inclusion is seen as a radical provocation that challenges the current status quo, whereas at the same time has been explored in terms of curriculum and assessment as a way of accommodating the diversity of learners. This fragmentation of approaches reflects on how inclusion translates into pedagogic principles. One of the basic principles of inclusive education is that all learners, without exception, should have a place in the learning encounter, and that it is an institution's requirement to change in order to accommodate diverse learners. This lies in opposition to the notion that students need to be assimilated within pre-existing structures and arrangements. For example, Ensko writes, "The aim of inclusive education is to restructure schools in order to respond to the needs of all children." This idea is often discussed as a distinction between inclusion as accommodation as opposed to assimilation. And it is a notion that can be traced back to the Salamanca Statement, the seminal UNESCO document that first used the term inclusion. Although the focus of the Salamanca Statement is mainly on disability and school education, the ideas can be taken more broadly to apply to other aspects of human diversity and different kinds of educational institutions. The Salamanca Statement states that schools should accommodate all children regardless regardless of their difficulties that could create a range of different challenges to school systems. So accommodation arrangements are notably envisaged to be a challenging process. However, the responsibility is placed on the institution, not the student. The pedagogic implications of this approach are outlined in this quote, and I'm reading: "Learning must accordingly be adapted to the needs of the child rather than the child fitted to preordained assumptions regarding the pace and nature of the reading process. Therefore, the institution is expected to change to accommodate the learner and other needs, rather than the learner to change to fit in with the institution." And these slides illustrate a visual representation of ideas about accommodation, which is the top right corner picture, and assimilation, which is the bottom right picture. You can see in the first picture, different students have been accommodated without having to change, whereas in the second one, the students have to change in order to fit in pre-existing arrangements. Now, the roots of the idea of inclusion as accommodation can be traced to the social model of disability theory that focuses on the principle that societal barriers and attitudes cause disability. The key proponent of the social model and disability rights activist Mike Oliver, for example, asserts, "We were not disabled by our impairments, but by the disabling barriers we faced in society." This way of thinking is seen as leading to a paradox, however, as social barriers by themselves cannot sufficiently explain what causes disability, since the experience of the body and or other individual factors interact with social factors to produce disability. Yet, the significance of the social model when translated into education is that it draws attention to factors that can be unmasked, challenged, or changed, such as the social environment within schools and teachers' and students' ways of thinking and attitudes. In addition, the social model moves attention away from what we might not be able to change, for example, certain impairments, or might not want to change, such as particular student identities or cultures, and one example could be deaf culture. But why is this point important? The significance of discussing inclusion as targeting individual students, that is, assimilation, or the institution, accommodation, lies in that different responses to this issue are likely to be translated into different pedagogical approaches, and perhaps also inform different institutional cultures that are more or less resistant to change. In turn, different understandings of what inclusion involves reflect also different and even contradictory perceptions of inclusive pedagogy. And let us now turn to the concept of inclusive pedagogy. When it comes to teaching and learning, a central principle of any inclusive pedagogy appears to be treating all students with respect. Showing or withholding respect has often been understood in different ways, as it is represented in the slide. On the one hand, it could be seen as about treating everybody the same to avoid stigmatization and marginalization. On the other hand, it could be seen as about treating people differently according to their requirements. This has been described as the dilemma of difference. However, the complexity lies in that the different positions are both desirable, and the aim is to achieve some balance and not to select one of them. And for example, one way to balance the two positions would be by offering individual support in non-stigmatizing ways. And this is just one way of thinking about inclusive pedagogy. Another way is through the pedagogic needs model by Lewis and Norwich. On the one hand, there is the gender differences positioned. And from that perspective, decisions on provision matters are informed by needs that are common to all learners, as well as needs that are unique to individuals. However, pedagogy is also informed by needs that are specific to a group that shares common characteristics, such as students speaking English as a foreign language. This represents a moderate approach to inclusion that is open to acknowledge student differences and especially group differences. But on the other hand, there is the unique differences positioned. And from this perspective, group-specific needs are not recognized because they are perceived as being automatically stigmatizing. This reflects a strong position on inclusion, what has been called as full inclusion. Responding to different student requirements has also often been discussed as differentiated learning or differentiation. Inclusion and differentiation can be seen to be in tension. For example, authors discuss a tension between differentiated and inclusive education and argue that the limits of inclusive education are in recognizing difference, while the limits of differentiated education are that it is potentially stigmatizing. And this echoes the often mentioned dilemma of difference, in that recognizing student difference might lead to stigmatization. However, failing to recognize difference might lead to loss of opportunities and restrictions in participation. And I'm now going to hand back to Lauren, who will discuss the implications of these theoretical ideas for our review.
Thanks, George. Okay, so how does all of this theory relate to our systematic review? Well, we try to use some of these theoretical ideas about inclusion to understand how the authors of the different papers of the 31 texts had understood and conceptualized inclusion and inclusive pedagogies in higher education, and how they advocated them as an approach. And we obtained some interesting findings. So if you look at the slide here, we have got a table here, which is taken from our paper. And so I'm not sure if you can see it. The text might be a little bit small, but you know, if you want to see more about this, have a look at the paper, and you can read the table a bit more clearly. But basically, it shows the different categorizations that we made. So we found that actually the authors took quite different approaches to inclusive pedagogy. And so some of the most notable ones were between these approaches that focused on commonality, which we noted in 9 papers, and approaches that emphasized individuality, which were apparent in 5 papers. So let's just clarify what we were meaning by that. So for instance, an author called Engelvin, she provided a case study of a registered blind student who was studying for a French degree at a UK university. And she talked about making tailor-made adjustments and differentiation by support and resources and tasks. So this included things such as providing a learning assistant, material in Braille, and giving the student extra time during examinations. So we classified that as an approach that emphasized individual difference. So the needs of the individual were emphasized there. Okay. In contrast, another researcher called Matthews advocated a pedagogical approach which was grounded in the social model of disability. In other words, as George was saying, where the social environment is seen as causing disability. And Matthews argued that educators should implement a diversity of different inclusive teaching strategies as part of everyday practice to avoid stigmatizing disabled students. So we categorized that one as a commonality approach because individual difference was minimized and provision was designed for all. And as you can see, the discussion is centering at the moment on disability. And we noticed that came through strongly in the papers. A lot of authors discussed inclusive pedagogies in the context of disability. However, this wasn't the sole focus. So other authors focused on, for example, gender or ethnicity. There were papers on international students, but there was a strong link between inclusion and disability. But we noted that other authors, so most of the authors, 12 authors, resorted to what we referred to as a more procedural version of inclusion that could be enacted through the deployment of specific instructional techniques, such as placing resources in online learning spaces or coordinating safe peer spaces, safe interactions between students in classes, choosing curricular examples that were culturally sensitive, choosing them in mindful ways. So yeah, we saw that as being very procedural, less theoretically underpinned, but just maybe strategies or tricks and tips that educators could use in order to become inclusive. However, we identified another set of authors who seemed to understand inclusive pedagogies as something more abstract. This seemed to be grounded in educators' personal identities, in their belief systems, and it was linked with a particular epistemological outlook. So these authors instead tasked educators in higher education with participating in more reflective and discursive strategies, such as asking questions, engaging in political debate, being reflexive about their own entrenched pedagogical assumptions and their practices. So examples from this set of authors included those working with and advocating post-colonial theory or disability theory. So the results of the review overall seem to indicate that there was much fragmentation and, one could argue, confusion around what inclusion is. This is because all of those different positions, although sometimes conflicting, could be said to be about inclusion. And these different approaches seem to reflect different interpretations and understandings of the values underpinning inclusion, such as respect, that translate into different pedagogical positions. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to end by considering some of the tensions that we see as apparent in the current drive towards inclusive universities and what we might learn from this systematic review. So it's important to acknowledge that schools and universities are different educational institutions with some different aims and purposes. So unlike the comprehensive school education system, which is attended by the majority of children in the UK, higher education is by nature selective. So careful consideration is needed in terms of how these concepts of inclusion and this notion of inclusion can be understood in this case. So in particular, elite universities such as Oxford have very strict academic entry requirements in order to maintain integrity in their quality and their excellence. So how can inclusion really be understood and realised within this context? So questions might be raised not only as to who is being included in higher education institutions at the point of access and how diverse the student body is, but also what cultures students are being included into. And this leads into debates regarding whether it is the responsibility of the student to change to fit within the institution, or whether it's the responsibility of the institution to change to meet the needs of diverse students, as George was talking about, accommodation or assimilation. Or maybe this is an oversimplistic dichotomy, should both be happening. So we conclude by suggesting that in the future, higher education researchers and educators ought to think more deeply and more philosophically about how they understand inclusion and inclusive pedagogies, and really engage with some of these potential tensions and fragmentations. So is inclusion about providing the individual student with additional support? Is it about changing resources so that they are accessible to everyone? Is it about adopting a particular epistemological outlook or a certain viewpoint as an educator? Or does inclusion require wider institutional change that perhaps extends far beyond the reach of the individual academic? So ultimately, our position, it fully acknowledges that and accepts that no simple or coherent resolution to inclusion can likely be offered up in response. And therefore, there are no simple or quick fixes that we can draw on to guarantee inclusion. So I think that covers, I'm not sure what the time is. I think we're under time by a little bit. But I guess that can mean more time for questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, George and Lauren. Really, lots there, and lots for people to chew over and mull over. What I didn't say at the beginning, which Robin from Comms advised me to do, is that if you do have a question, to use the chat function, and if you put some chat into yours or any questions into that chat function, I can pick up. So I've got a question from Victoria, or Vicky, I think. It's funny to see it as Victoria. So given the different ways to conceptualize what inclusion actually means and the tensions you describe in your paper and this presentation, is there a risk that we will spend too much time talking about what inclusion is and not sufficient time actually doing something about it? So there's that tension between thinking and practice. Would your research offer any recommendations of how to avoid getting stuck at the discursive stage about what it actually means, at the risk of not actually putting anything into practice? So we're going to talk a lot about it, we're going to theorize about it, and that's kind of, is that, I suppose, kicking into the long grass? So yeah, but Vicky's asking a practical question, recommendations of how to avoid getting stuck in that discursive stage.
That's a really good question, and one that me and George have talked a lot about, and with in collaboration with colleagues as well. We're asked about this a lot, and I don't know if George, do you want to?
Yeah, I could say something that.
Yeah.
when you start with your example, Jason, at the beginning, this is exactly what I thought actually. That the inclusion is really important for some people, and what we do is, I think it's also important. But we should never forget that for some people, something real, something that affects their everyday life. So we do have responsibility there. And Victoria, that's a great question. So my approach to that is that it's a bit rare for inclusion to be explored in some sort of depth. I'm not saying it never happens. There is literature out there which is very critical, very questioning, very deep. But generally, inclusion is not explored or has not been explored to a good depth, I think. So in order to be able to implement it better, we need to understand it. We do not need to deconstruct it to the extent that means nothing, or to the extent that there's just an endless debate without an end. But I think it's our responsibility to explore it, to understand it, so that we can promote it better. No, not so that we can deconstruct it completely in an academic exercise.
Yes,
Lauren,
and yeah, no, I think we discussed as well with a lot of the academic developers at Exeter University, who do require, they need to work with academics to give them certain.
You've dropped out. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yep. Okay, brilliant. Okay, yes. So we work a lot with the academic developers at Exeter, who actually their responsibility is to provide academics with inclusive strategies. And we were noting in particular that they were coming to us maybe and asking, well, what is inclusion? How do we actually practice this? What is practice informed by? And actually, I think one of the key arguments in the paper that we were making is that particularly, can you hear me still? Yeah. Yes. Okay, brilliant. And that particularly within the higher education sector, inclusion hasn't been addressed, particularly at the philosophical level. And actually the papers that we found recommended certain strategies, but perhaps they weren't underpinned by as much theory as we would maybe expect, or we wanted to investigate that more. So as George says, we totally appreciate that importance needs to be placed on practice. And that's a delicate balance. You want to ideally, I think, do both. You need to do this theoretical work and look at it at that level, but then actually you do need to at some point translate that into practice.
Okay, I've got a couple more. I'm going to pick up on the COVID. There's a COVID question that's coming, and I'll pick up on that. Vicky's just come back on the response and just sort of talking about really good, whether you've encountered really good examples of how HE institutions have made their work inclusive. But perhaps if I might sort of bring Vicky's previous question back, which is maybe to ask you explicitly if you can remember to talk about Cunningham's work, where he, I think they were using a sort of a self-reflective tool that HE educators could use in order to do. So it's kind of like, it felt, I mean, I haven't read the Cunningham, but it felt like Cunningham was offering something that was both practical, a practical tool for thinking through some of the issues that HE colleagues could do. And it reminded me of a sort of, Cochrane Smith, Marilyn Cochrane Smith and some colleagues in Australia did a faculty self-study as a way of actually sort of getting to a practical point, but actually it wasn't simply talk, it was actually doing something with regard to the self-study. And I felt like Cunningham's self-reflective tool was actually something quite tangible, as well as engaging with thinking for purpose. So maybe it might be useful to talk about Cunningham's work, or not.
Yes, no, I know Cunningham's work, yes. So I would argue as well that the purpose of our paper was slightly different. So we felt that actually there was quite a lot of focus within the higher education literature on providing these tools. And actually we wanted to take a step back, and actually we felt that it was the theory that was missing. And that's what we wanted to really explore. So we felt like maybe this has been discussed a lot in the SEND literature, in the SEND field. And actually, we wanted to translate some of those ideas. So that's what Cunningham maybe hasn't done as much, and others haven't worked with some of these philosophical debates and theories. And actually, we felt that that was in particular missing. So I think that our paper was one of the first to engage more deeply in that respect. So I think that's, so actually there might be a bit more practical advice around that, but we wanted to actually map out more. So for example, take a step above the Cunningham and say, actually, there's lots of different academics who are talking about higher education and inclusion, but actually we wanted to say, okay, let's map out what they were all looking at. So some of them will look at it in relation to disability, some of them will look at it in relation to ethnicity, or there was a lack of it in gender, in terms of gender, which was quite interesting in terms of the use of inclusive pedagogy. So we were trying to map out the field and what was being done. I think it just had, our paper just had a slightly different purpose, I think. I mean, George, do you want to comment?
I could just add a little bit. Vicky, I wouldn't just, Victoria, sorry, I wouldn't just pick one good example of inclusion, just because I don't think that, one approach to inclusion would work in all cases for all students, for all institutions, for all circumstances. I think inclusion is different. It's something that works differently in different places, can take different forms, different meanings. And I think this is one of the messages we wanted to give at in our paper, that it's not just one approach. It's a range of approaches, and one has to engage with this kind of uncertainty that inclusion can be different things at the same time for different people.
Okay, so with the mention of uncertainty, I'm going to go to the COVID question. And obviously, we have all been in that sort of situation. I think it's a really great question. So seen as COVID-19 has forced many people to stay at home, learn remotely, we're all on this Zoom call. Do you think that online learning is a step forward in terms of inclusive learning, or do you think it's a step back, especially in terms of that constructivist sort of dichotomy that you were talking about in terms of the sage on the stage versus vis-a-vis the constructivist type of approach? So sort of, your views on the possibilities, but also perhaps the caveats with regard to this online world that we're now in. Who wants to pick that one up?
George, do you want to, or do you want me to go first?
Well, I would just say very quickly that we kind of having to live with that for, is it 1.5 years now, teaching online endlessly. And I guess, Jason, you have the same situation, possibly all the people attending us. So I don't know. I really don't know. I think it has opened up possibilities. We can now connect to people from all around the world, and we can all be together in the same virtual room and have a discussion. And we do that almost every day. And we all people have become a little bit, I mean, if they have the means, but we have become a little bit more comfortable with the use of technology. We know, there are so many tools one can use, like, I don't know, even Mentimeter that we used at the beginning. We knew all that thing before, but perhaps we weren't so comfortable. We haven't, we hadn't used them to such an extent. So I don't know. I think in some sort of ways it has given more tools to people. Or if you are, say, like I am, English is not my first language, so I can always turn on captions on all sessions, which I think is great in a way. But of course, there is in front of you just a screen. It's just like a wall, and there is no real interaction between people. It's kind of like a mediated kind of interaction through a screen. It's always a barrier. So I honestly don't know. Lauren?
Yes. No, and I think again it's kind of what we were saying before. It's very it can vary depending on the different person, and some people would prefer it, some people don't prefer it. So it's so difficult to say that something is a good thing because it's very context dependent and situational. So obviously, yes, a lot of you here will probably be teaching in classes where all students have their cameras turned off, or it can be very difficult to get people to talk online and to feel comfortable to interact with other people. Maybe you can't make those social connections. And as we were saying, in terms of what we found in the review about social constructivist theories of teaching and learning, maybe that does inhibit that type of approach. So as George was saying, it has its strengths, it maybe has its weaknesses. It's a necessity at the moment, and I suspect yes, it will, we will do a lot more things online now, but yeah, I think it does have its limits, but I think it's just being aware of those. Yes, so as George says, it's difficult to say for sure, I'm going to give a definitive answer, but yeah.
I mean, I suppose it goes back to some of the original foundations of what you're kind of making a play for here. Is it depends on how you conceptualize teaching in the first instance before you then go to the technology. I remember when I was a school teacher, and my school had some capital funding to put interactive whiteboards into every single classroom. And then Bechter did a research study on the impact of those interactive whiteboards, which actually found that actually there's less interactivity subsequent to those interactive whiteboards. And lots of teachers went more PowerPoint and much more, sort of slide, one pace type of teaching than they were before. And it's about how you're thinking about your teaching and your inclusive practice prior to actually then thinking, now what can the technology do that can help me in this particular type of approach? So that conceptualization still matters, doesn't it, in relation to the technology? I think we've got time for one more question. I'm gonna so Natasha has asked, do higher education institutions need to be more explicit or theoretically aware about the criteria that they feel are justified grounds for exclusion? So sort of thinking about the sorts of, I mean, Natasha, you might need to come back a little bit on that and just talk about what you mean by the justified grounds of exclusion. But yeah, so do HE institutions need to be more explicit about the criteria that they feel are justified grounds for exclusion?
I think we have discussed a lot with Lauren about the future steps for what we did with our paper. One of the things we are thinking about is how higher education is a selective kind of sphere, especially certain very prestigious institutions are selective. They have criteria that you have to meet in order to be part of the community, and then at the same time, we're discussing about inclusion in this context. So I'm guessing that Natasha might refer to something like that, because some people will be excluded from higher education just because there are criteria, there are they have to have the grades, they have to have, I don't know. So
And I suppose her question is then, do they need to be more explicit about why those grades exist? You know, what purpose do they serve in relation to the institution, I guess, or the pedagogy?
What we're doing with Lauren this couple of months is we try to see how the policies of Russell Group institutions describe inclusion. We haven't done that analysis yet. We're still working on it anyway. But I don't think that the higher education institutions are particularly explicit about this criteria. They seem to present themselves as very inclusive. Whereas actually one could question that to some extent, which is interesting. I don't know, Laura, whether you want to say anything on that.
No, I mean, yes, as George was saying, it's just we do notice this tension between this inclusive agenda that is being kind of espoused within the higher education realm and how actually they are by nature exclusionary. So maybe it would be, but then again, the question would be, how would you make explicit that you are being exclusionary? Because obviously no institution would want to necessarily outline that, apart from obviously the offers that they give to students. But then there's the issues of, for example, contextual offers for those maybe from disadvantaged backgrounds. So there are, I guess, those certain criteria around inclusion and exclusion, or whether it would maybe be, or maybe you were talking, Natasha, maybe a bit more about inclusion and exclusion within the classroom, within the university classroom, within teaching spaces, and maybe what constitutes exclusive practice, teaching practice, and what constitutes inclusive teaching practice. So if we maybe talk at people, is that exclusive, or actually is that what you expect at university? Maybe some students come to the university and expect to hear from, very high reputation academics. Maybe that's what you're expecting. So again, I think it's about probing these issues more deeply and understanding some of the conflicts and tensions around it and investigating those. I think that's where the productiveness can happen, engaging with those tensions. Yeah, did Natasha reply, or?
Yeah, she mentioned excellence and quality in relation to being inherent, in terms of Oxford, talk about excellence and quality, but do we need to be more honest about what lies behind that, what actually that really means, and why that perhaps exists in the first place? I've got one more question, so because I think you have kind of covered some of Natasha's points, and it's a barnstormer from Niall. So in terms of to sort of end on, but how do you think inclusive pedagogies can address issues of intersectional marginalization? So I know, because I mean, you talked about the sort of certainly the disabilities or discourse and where that came from, but I know that not all the studies were, the focus was on disability necessarily or gender, and some of it was about general student diversity. So yeah, how do you think they can address intersectional marginalization, multiple marginalizations? Any thoughts about that for an ending?
Do you want to start, George, or shall I? Well, what we did notice in the papers that we identified in this review in particular was that, and as I was saying before, is that it was an overwhelming focus on disability, and actually there wasn't so much written about, and in particular, as we say, this notion of intersectionality was not covered as much. It was mainly focusing on one facet of student diversity. So it's true that maybe more attention should be paid, and maybe there needs to be some more studies in terms of this notion of intersectionality, because obviously we totally appreciate that disability is only one identity category, and it is cut through with, for example, ethnicity and gender and so on. So yes, I mean, George, do you have anything to add?
Just to say that we were trying to explore intersectional experiences in a small-scale project with Lauren in the past, and it was so difficult to do that. I know there are studies, there are many studies, brilliant studies, I'm sure, but it's so difficult to do research and kind of understand this kind of experience, which is so complex. So I think this is partly why it's quite difficult for people to, approach it, define it, embed it into something, translate into practical action. People refer to intersectionality, but in a more kind of superficial way, perhaps. But if you want to translate into something or understand it better, I think it's quite a complex notion.
And I guess it feeds into the argument of the paper as well, is we can't really just have a toolbox of tricks and tips and pedagogical strategies that we can. So if we say, oh, if we do a Padlet activity, this is going to encourage everyone to participate, or this is going to hit the target audience, we just can't do that. I don't think we can't recommend certain strategies that are a quick solution, a magic bullet. It's just, we don't think it's possible. But what we can do is we can be aware of the issues around intersectionality and identities, student experiences in higher education. We can research that, we can make it explicit. We can, as higher education researchers and educators, we can learn about this. We can read the studies, we can engage with theory, we can engage with philosophy, we can engage with moral tensions, and that can help us to be reflexive practitioners and to improve and enhance our practice. So I think basically that was the key argument in the paper, is we've got to engage with this, and tricks and tips are perhaps not as applicable in this instance. But yeah, George.
No, I think it's covered everything. That's it.
I think that's a great point. But if we go back to the beginning and the Mentimeter, people talked about contested subjectivities, and we know that those subjectivities are contingent. There are moments where my sexuality might be more pertinent to the way in which I'm self-identifying, depending on the context, and then other times where my ethnic background might actually be the thing that's personally defining my interaction at that particular moment. So to have one solution, that's just me, is not going to be sort of a way forward for me as a learner or me as an academic within that particular field. So thank you so much for encouraging us, I think, basically to really embrace uncertainty and complexity, and in order to kind of not resort to a procedural approach and really think through some of those complex issues. And I think that's kind of why I started with Anthony at the beginning, because I think it was a kind of iterative solution that's well-intentioned, but deprived more about his inclusion than gave him necessarily. So thank you very, very much. Thank you everybody else for contributing and all your comments. And attentiveness. Really, really useful to hear people thinking, and we've got work to do. We've definitely got work to do. And George and Lauren, thank you for helping us think about some of the issues, the multiple issues. I urge everybody to read the paper. It's really useful, really profoundly useful in terms of ways of conceptualizing inclusion that I think would help us in our conversations. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much, Kate, for inviting us, and to everybody for being with us here.
Not at all.
Thank you.
Great. Robin, do we need to do anything else?
No, that's grand. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you much. George and Lauren, happy with that? Yeah. Any